Howdy folks, I'm here to tell y'all the way time works in your tabletop campaigns is wrong. I'm not talking about calendars or short and long rests, I'm talking about the way it progresses in your game. The way you decide time moves forward in your game is wrong. Y'all are gonna bristle at that, but first I'm gonna give you all a rule, tell you about its benefits, and then we'll get to objections at the end. The rule has two parts. The actual rule, published by Gary Gygax on page 37 of the AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide, and a procedure used to enhance it. Let's jump into it. So first up we have the rule we call one-to-one time. It states that for each day that passes in real life, one day passes in-game. The in-game calendar moves forward one day for each day that passes in real life. If y'all play on Monday, y'all don't play again until next Monday. 7 days will have progressed in your game. Next up is a procedure that we commonly refer to as time jail. It states that your characters are inaccessible until the real-life calendar catches up to them. If your character spends about 4 weeks training to level up, you've got 4 weeks to play another character until they're available again. The procedure of time jail prevents characters from advancing too far ahead in the in-game calendar. They can only get as far ahead as a single session will take them. This combination of Gary's one-to-one time rule and the time jail procedure is known as Jeffro Gygaxian timekeeping. We're going to do a separate video on the history of one-to-one time, but I'd be remiss not to credit a fellow named Jeffro Johnson. He's the author of a book called Appendix N, The Literary History of Dungeons & Dragons, and he committed himself to running AD&D as close to as written as he could possibly get. This started a grand campaign back in 2020, which has only grown since then, and it's revealed a ton of details about 70s RPG and wargaming culture, as well as since-forgotten rules like one-to-one time. I want to make this perfectly clear. Wet your tongue for the history video, this rule would have remained buried and forgotten by conventional RPG designers, even the ones who were present from the very beginning, without Jeffro. Now, there's a lot of misconceptions about one-to-one time, how they interact with the campaign, and how different groups can make use of them. We're going to start off with how the rule impacts big groups, then small groups, effects universal to one-to-one time, and then finally, address a few objections. Now, grand campaigns, multiple parties coming to the same table, or even multiple DMs handling them are where one-to-one time shines most. I've got a few benefits for running a larger group with this rule. First up is fairness. One-to-one time is universally fair. You see, time must advance forward in your game. Events must take place. The campaign must progress to feel real. There's no way to move the campaign forward without it feeling arbitrary if you just leave it up to DM fiat. Group A moves forward 10 days, Group B moves forward 20 days, Group C moves forward 100 days. If you move the game forward 100 days so folks can catch up to Group C, Group A and B are going to be pissed off. They were hoping to get stuff accomplished in the next 90 days. Group C didn't want to have to wait for everyone to catch up, and the DM didn't want to manage 3 different timelines if they happened to contradict one another. Well, the DM can make a different decision in this scenario, but it's not going to make a difference. No matter what they decide, the outcome is artificial and unfair. You can only avoid this by using a rule. It has to be universal, it can't change from group to group or on a whim. The players need to know how time will advance in advance, so they can set plans and expend resources accordingly. Time is their most important resource in a grand campaign. Other players are vying for the same dungeons. Patrons and NPCs are wiping out potential safe havens or places to train as they war with one another. Regions are rendered uninhabitable or even too unsafe to travel through as war and magic rip up the campaign map. That brings us to campaign scale. You see, the more game elements are exposed to the ravages of time, the more incentives players have to fortify their position in the campaign. If towns and keeps will fall according to campaign events, the players must erect towns and keeps of their own if they wish to secure access to markets and trainers of their own. Towns and keeps require carpenters, stonemasons, miners, farmers, and blacksmiths to build and maintain. They require mages and men-at-arms to keep safe. They require adventurers to bring gold and prestige to their tiny slice of land, which in turn attracts the attention of movers and shakers on the campaign map. This accelerates our next benefit, which is the concept of an always-on campaign. The game stops for no one, baby. It doesn't matter whether your usual DM, usual play group, or usual characters are available. There's a game to be had right now with whoever you can get a hold of. The clock is always ticking. There's loot out there waiting for you. Why wait for game night? See, one-to-one time is a rule that generates what we call West Marches style play naturally. Speaking of West Marches style play, having multiple groups, having multiple DMs, one-to-one time fixes a huge problem with having a bunch of different people run for you. By cutting out the question of when certain events are more or less allowed to happen, or at least constraining them pretty heavily, coordinating between multiple referees becomes a comparative breeze. It's far easier to coordinate between multiple DMs running for two different groups when you all know those two different groups are playing in the same month, probably the same week. So if y'all go online and ask folks about one-to-one time, you'll hear from a corner of old school players, the rule only works with large groups. It doesn't benefit small groups, just waste time, and generally serves as an inconvenience. I'm here to tell you, having tested it, this is not the case. Making one day pass in the game for every day that passes in real life offers 3 benefits, unique to smaller groups. I'm going to list them out here for you. First on the docket is the unique fail state. The party has a unique fail state with regards to time-sensitive goals. Just because the party isn't competing with other player characters doesn't mean the world takes a pause. Players are competing with NPCs. Somewhere out there is a big bad evil guy. Is he waiting on the players to come kick his ass? Of course not. Who would want to play in a campaign like that? He is out there in the world achieving his own time-sensitive goals, and the faster the players undercut him, the easier the campaign will get. And if the players don't stop him in time, if they clear out one room or fight one combat per week, well, they lose the campaign. If the bad guy gets to progress unimpeded because their players can't make decisions, they hedge too much in fights, they never expand resources, then they lose, and you kill off what is basically a dying campaign anyways. You don't have to worry about it lasting until the end of time or until, you pull the plug on it. Finally, the campaign will just end. And y'all can decide whether or not you want to restart the campaign or want to do it with different players. So next up is multiple characters. The use of time jail, like we talked about earlier, preserves the incentive to make and use multiple characters, which I'm now convinced is basically required for a healthy tabletop RPG experience, especially when it comes to older games. Your players probably won't make multiple characters unless their main man is inaccessible. It can be inconvenient to not have your favorite character on hand. We all get attached to whatever we've invested the most time in. But the trade-off offers you new mechanics, new modes of play, new party compositions. It's a tiny inconvenience to expand your range of experiences at the table. Last up on our list of benefits for one-to-one time in smaller groups is bigger rosters. One-to-one time offers up the opportunity to not have a smaller group. Let's make up a hypothetical example here. Let's say that your party's characters have been rendered inaccessible for about 2 weeks. 2 folks decide this is their chance to take a break for a week. But you have 2 other potential players who never got to join the main group. You play in the intervening week, everyone has a great time, and they decide they want to come back for more. You repeat this process once or twice, and you have a second playgroup. You have enough people for a second group of characters, or a second session time. You can play more than once per week. All this makes one-to-one time an engine to produce a larger rosters of players and characters. It doesn't matter if you think one-to-one time is a poor fit for smaller campaigns, because it produces a larger campaign. Now, there's a couple benefits universal to tables using one-to-one time. First up is the leveling agent. This is actually a quote from my buddy John, who runs the Joy of Wargaming YouTube channel. put a card up for him here. Go check him out. Give him a sub. He says that time acts as a universal leveling agent. Time is the one resource that every player gets in equal measure. Some may be luckier, some may know the rules better, some may read the DM better, but time waits for no man. Here John's saying the rule preserves one opportunity for all players to hold an equal seat at the table, to be as good as the folks who are luckier, smarter with the rules, can tell what's going on behind the DM screen. That opportunity is using your time wisely. There's a Gygax quote about this actually from the DMG, and I feel obligated to read it out here. You may ask why time is so important if it causes such difficulties with record keeping, dictates who can or cannot go adventuring during a game session, and disperses player characters to the four winds by its strictures. Well, as initially pointed out, it is a necessary penalty imposed upon characters for certain activities. Beyond that, it also gives players yet another interesting set of choices and consequences. The latter tends to bring more true-to-life quality to the game, as some characters will use precious time to the utmost advantage. Some will treat it lightly, and some will be constantly wasting it to their complete detriment. Time is yet another facet which helps to separate the superior players from the lesser ones. If timekeeping is a must from a penalty standpoint, it is also an interesting addition from the standpoint of running a campaign. Harsh words from the big man himself, but I'm inclined to agree. Next up is downtime. See, it's pretty common for folks playing the game to get dragged around from one encounter to the next. Even though time isn't really an object in most of these games, parties will object to letting one person spend a hot minute gathering information or crafting a potion. Folks who like downtime generally have one specific activity they're invested in, while the rest of the table is more interested in progressing the rest of the game. Even if everyone has a downtime activity in mind, they're all outvoted by the group's desire to get adventuring. Time may not cost anything in the game, but it does have a cost at the table. Discussing downtime actions can soak up a lot of session time. It's understandable why parties are less inclined to indulge in downtime actions. To them, I'm sure it feels like a big waste of the most precious resource. The trade-off is the biggest loss in range of gameplay experiences the party could possibly inflict on themselves. One-to-one time fixes all of this. Somehow, by making in-game time a resource you could lose, activities which make the most of in-game time become a bigger priority. Who would have thought? The knowledge time will progress from the end of the session to the beginning of next session also keeps the resolution of downtime actions siloed. You know when the clock will start ticking again, so you'll wait until the session's end to harass your DM while other players filter out the door. Thanks to the internet and cell phones, these activities can all be handled effortlessly between sessions, and not soak up time at the table. Well, I promised y'all I'd get to objections at the end, and here we are at the end, so I better come up with some objections. I feel obligated to note the discussion of one-to-one time has produced some of the most deranged conversations on social media I've ever had the displeasure of witnessing. If you're like me and you've only been playing for a decade or so, you're unlikely to grow unpleasant on account of hearing some neat new rule to enjoy in your game. But apparently, some more conventional RPG pundits and designers, particularly the ones who've been at this for too long, can't help themselves but to start wailing and gnashing their teeth. I tell you this as a warning, we might have accidentally stumbled onto a CIA activation phrase. First up, we have the question of what happens when we end the session in a dungeon. This rather interesting and useful question is extremely important in the context of why we write rules. See, in older games, dungeons had prescribed random encounter checks. Encounters were nasty, and you couldn't rest in a dungeon without a substantial amount of work ensuring your particular slice of cave or musty hallway was relatively safe. On top of that, dungeons had rules for restocking themselves. Take into account just how likely random encounters were to kill off a player or henchman, and you could see how it wouldn't be smart to stick in a dungeon if time kept running after you stopped playing. Remember, you don't want to react to a new rule or procedure by thinking of all the bad things that would happen if you kept playing the same way. Instead, think of how your behavior at the table would change if a rule was in place. If staying in a dungeon for a week between sessions was a sure recipe for death and dismemberment, I'm sure you and your party will be smart enough to take a hike back to camp. So the short answer? You don't end the session in dungeons anymore. Next up, we have the idea that it's all just timekeeping. See, some folks have a really weird reaction whenever this rule is discussed publicly. Timekeeping to them is just tracking where one session ends and where another session begins. One-to-one time, then, is a gimmick, which overly complicates the process of writing down when a session ended and where the next one begins. This criticism ignores the point of rules and why we write them down. I'm not oversimplifying, it's just that silly. When we write a rule about how time interacts with the game, it's to change how players and referees interact with the game as well. The procedure wasn't just some gimmick we wrote down for fun. Designers create rules like this to change what happens at a table. This criticism probably feels especially dumb at the end of a video where we painstakingly detail as many effects of one-to-one time as we could think of. From fairness and advancing the world for all players, increasing the campaign scale, participating in an always-on campaign, having multiple DMs, having a unique fail-state for parties and players, having multiple characters, producing a bigger roster of players and characters, enjoying a universal level in Asian, and finally, preserving a space for all players to engage in downtime. Given the folks who make this sort of objection didn't put any thought into their objection to begin with, it probably is about as dumb as you're imagining. Finally, there's a few extra smart folks out there who've come up with their own special gotcha just for us. They tell us, diplomas and honors in hand, that some activities in-game take longer than just one day. Some activities, such as a dungeon delve, are listed as taking a week on that very same page on which one-to-one time is mentioned. How can we possibly be engaged in one-to-one time if certain activities like travel and dungeon delves take longer than one day? The answer's pretty simple. That has nothing to do with the rule we call one-to-one time. As a refresher, one-to-one time states that for each day that passes in real life between sessions, one day will have elapsed in-game. This has no bearing on whether the party can take actions or go on adventures in the course of their session, which take them longer than one day. In fact, the procedure of time jail is used explicitly to ensure the real-life calendar will catch up to those players who advance to a point in the in-game calendar further than waiting for your next session would produce. In short, one-to-one time is the name of the rule, and as such serves as an abbreviation for the rule's full and active description. If something's made you so incensed as to ask whether your party has to wait 2 weeks should your character choose to spend that time scratching their ass, I recommend closing your internet browser of choice, turning off your computer, and getting a nice heaping handful of that pleasant green stuff on your front lawn. Well, folks, it's been a fun time. I'd highly encourage y'all to start using one-to-one time in your games, but especially if your games have some kind of downtime actions or other things to do while you're not adventuring. Even if your core rules don't use them, someone out there has made a list of things for your characters to do between sessions. Go use them. There's a man from YouTube standing behind me who definitely does not have a metal object pointed at my head, who's instructed me to tell y'all about the subscribe button and little bell icon. Click those and new videos of mine will show up in your feeds and notifications. He doesn't know this rattlesnake on my hat is still alive, but that's for him to find out and for you to laugh about as you click that bell. Expect to see another preview video later this week and another main video next week. We'll be doing about one big video and one preview per week to keep us on a good upload schedule. Without any further ado, peace. One more thing before I go. I forgot to credit Blue Dot Sessions for the wonderful and lovely music that you heard throughout the course of this video. Alright, now I mean it. Peace.